He had been in the Army for 3 years when he saw the thing that changed everything. And in those 3 years, he had seen a great deal that a 22-year-old from rural Indiana had not been prepared to see, and that nobody had adequately prepared him for, because there was no adequate preparation. He had been through basic training at Fort Benning and had shipped to England in the spring of 1944 and had come ashore in Normandy 6 weeks after D-Day, when the beachhead was established and the first phase of the dying was over. And the second phase, the long, grinding push through France and into Germany, was beginning. He had been through the hedgerow country, and the breakout, and the winter of the Bulge, and the Rhine crossing, and the drive into Bavaria in the spring of 1945, when the German army was collapsing and the end was visible, and the only question was how much more it was going to cost before the visible end actually arrived. He had seen men killed. He had seen men wounded in ways that no training exercise and no prior knowledge of what weapons did to human bodies had fully communicated. He had been afraid in the specific, sustained way that combat produces, not the acute fear of a single dangerous moment, but the chronic background fear of a man who understands that the danger is not going to stop until it stops, and has no way of knowing when that will be. He had processed all of this, not completely, not without cost, but he had found a way to continue functioning in the presence of what he was experiencing, which was what the army required, and what the situation demanded, and what the men around him were doing. And the doing of it was something he had in common with every man in his unit and most men in the army, which made it bearable in the way that shared experience makes things bearable even when the experience itself is not. None of that prepared him for the morning of April 29, 1945. Private First Class Harold Berman was from Terre Haute, Indiana. He was the son of a hardware store owner and a former school teacher, the eldest of 3 children, a young man who had been good at mathematics and adequate at everything else, and who had been planning, before the war interrupted the planning, to study accounting at Indiana State and come back to Terre Haute and eventually take over the hardware store from his father, who was not getting younger and whose knees were giving him trouble. The plan was ordinary. The plan was what most young men from Terre Haute were planning in 1941. Some version of the ordinary life that the town and the family and the expectations of the time made available. Pearl Harbor had interrupted the plan. Harold had enlisted in January of 1942, the same month that tens of thousands of other young men made the same decision, and the army had trained him and shipped him to England, and eventually to France, and eventually to Germany. And in the spring of 1945, he was 22 years old and a private first class in the 45th Infantry Division, 7th Army, and he was moving through Bavaria with the rest of his unit in the direction of a town called Dachau. He did not know what was at Dachau. The men in his unit did not know. The officers knew something, or knew that something was there, but the specific knowledge of what the camp contained had not filtered down to the infantry level in a way that gave the men who were going to walk into it any real preparation for what they were going to find. There had been reports. The Allied intelligence services had known about the camp system since the late 1930s. The newspapers had carried stories. The word concentration camp existed in the language that Harold Berman had grown up speaking. But the word, and the thing the word referred to, existed at a distance from each other that distance alone could not account for. The word was a word. The thing was a thing. The gap between them was not a failure of information. It was a failure of the imagination to construct from available information what the information actually described. The 45th Infantry Division approached the camp from the north on the morning of April 29th. They had been moving quickly. The German resistance in Bavaria in the final weeks of the war was inconsistent, sometimes fierce and sometimes absent, and the men of the 45th had developed the particular alertness of soldiers who knew that the end was close, but that close was not the same as over, and that the gap between close and over was still capable of killing them. They heard the camp before they saw it. Not sounds of violence, not the sounds of a facility in operation. What they heard was a quality of sound, or an absence of the sounds that a place with thousands of people in it should have been producing, that communicated something to the men moving toward it before they had information to explain what they were hearing. Harold described it decades later in an interview conducted by a historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum as a silence that was too large. He said it was not quiet, it was something else. Something that silence is not quite the right word for. He said he did not have the right word for it, and in 50 years of trying to describe it, he had not found one. They came through the outer perimeter and into the camp. Harold Berman stopped walking. This is the detail that he returned to in every account he gave over the following decades. In the testimony he provided at military proceedings in the weeks after liberation, in the interviews with historians, in the talks he gave at schools and memorial services and veterans events. He stopped walking. Not because someone told him to stop, not because there was an obstacle, because his body made a decision that his mind had not yet caught up with. The decision that the information arriving through his eyes required a moment of complete stillness before it could be processed. And the stillness was not voluntary in the way that most stillness is voluntary. He stood still for what he later estimated was approximately 1 minute, though he acknowledged that his sense of time in that moment was not reliable. The men around him were also still, or moving slowly, or doing what he was doing, which was trying to integrate what they were seeing into a framework that their previous experience had not provided. What they were seeing was the evidence of what had happened in this place over the 12 years of its operation. Not the operation itself, which had ceased in the final days before liberation. The evidence, the residue, the specific character of a place where human beings had been held and treated in ways that the 1945 mind of a 22-year-old from Terre Haute, Indiana, had no framework to receive. He did not describe what he saw in graphic terms in any of his subsequent accounts. This was not evasion, it was the opposite of evasion. He had concluded, over the years of telling the story, that the graphic description was the wrong approach to the truth of the place. Because graphic description produced in the listener a response to the specific details rather than a response to the fact, and the fact was larger than any specific detail could contain. He had tried graphic description in the early years, in the immediate aftermath, in the testimony he gave when the events were new and the instinct was to describe exactly what he had seen. The graphic description made people flinch and look away, and looking away was the opposite of what needed to happen. He had learned to describe it differently. He described it as a place where you understood, for the first time, with your whole body rather than just your mind, that the things people did to each other were not limited by any boundary he had previously believed existed. He described it as the removal of an assumption he had not known he was making, the assumption that there was a floor below which things did not go, a level of what human beings would do to other human beings that was the bottom, and that the bottom existed. He described walking into Dachau as the discovery that the floor he had been standing on was not there. This is what he spent the next 50 years trying to explain. Not the specific things he saw. The specific things were describable. Other people had described them. Historians and journalists and prosecutors and survivors had described them with precision and documentation and the full resources of the written language. The description existed. Harold Berman was not carrying a description that the world lacked. What he was carrying was the experience of being present in that place on that morning, and the specific change that the presence had made in him, and the understanding that the change was not communicable in the way that most experiences are communicable, through description and analogy and the bridges that shared human experience provides between one person's inner life and another's. The change was not communicable because the bridge did not exist. The bridge is built from shared experience. The people Harold Berman was trying to reach had not been at Dachau on April 29, 1945. They had not stood still for 1 minute while their body processed something that their mind could not immediately receive. They had the words, they did not have the experience behind the words. And the experience behind the words was the thing that the words were trying to reach. He gave his first formal testimony in May of 1945, 3 weeks after liberation, in a military proceeding that was part of the documentation effort that the Army conducted in the immediate aftermath of the camp discoveries. He sat across the table from a military lawyer and answered questions for 2 hours. The questions were specific, and the answers he gave were specific, and the testimony was transcribed and entered into the record, and eventually made its way into the body of documentation that supported the Nuremberg proceedings. He was 22 years old when he gave that testimony. He had been out of the camp for 3 weeks. The testimony was accurate. He knew it was accurate because he had been there, and he was describing what he had seen with the precision that the proceedings required. He also knew, with a certainty that the accuracy of the testimony did not diminish, that the testimony was not adequate, that the words he was saying in that room were true and were not sufficient, that the gap between the true words and the thing the true words were attempting to describe was a gap that the words could not close. He went home to Terre Haute in December of 1945. His father had kept the hardware store open. His mother had kept the house. His brother and sister had grown in the 3 years he had been gone, his sister into a young woman he almost did not recognize on the platform at the train station, his brother into a teenager who wanted to hear about the war in the way that teenage boys want to hear about war, with the specific appetite for the dramatic and the heroic that Harold had possessed himself before the war had replaced that appetite with something more complicated. He did not know how to talk to his brother about the war. This was not unique to Harold Berman. The men who came home in the winter of 1945 and the spring of 1946 mostly did not know how to talk about what they had experienced, and the people waiting for them mostly did not know how to ask in ways that produced the real conversation rather than the acceptable version of the conversation. The country was relieved and celebratory and grateful and wanted the men back and wanted the war to be over. And the men were back and the war was over. And the space between what the country wanted the homecoming to be and what the men were actually carrying was a space that most families navigated by not navigating it, by setting it aside in favor of the forward motion of resumed ordinary life. Harold resumed ordinary life. He took the accounting courses at Indiana State. He came back to the hardware store. He married a woman named Ruth in 1948. They had 3 children. The house they lived in was 4 blocks from the house he had grown up in, which was not a failure of ambition, but a choice. The choice of a man who had been far from home and understood what home meant in a way that the leaving and the returning had clarified. He did not talk about Dachau with Ruth in the first years, not because he was hiding it, because he had not yet found the way in. The thing he was carrying did not have an entrance that the ordinary language of a marriage provided access to. He knew it was there. Ruth knew something was there. The knowing on both sides was present and was not acknowledged directly, which was how a great many marriages of that generation carried the weight of what the war had put into the men who fought it. He talked to her about it for the first time in 1953, 8 years after liberation. They were sitting in the kitchen after the children were in bed, and something on the radio had mentioned the Nuremberg trials, one of the subsequent proceedings that had been running in the years after the main trial, and Harold had been quiet in a way that Ruth recognized as different from his ordinary quiet, more internal, more still. She asked him what he was thinking. He told her about the morning of April 29th. He talked for 2 hours. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her, and which Harold said later was the thing that made it possible. The quality of her listening, the absence of the flinching and the looking away that his early attempts to describe the experience had produced in other listeners. She did not look away. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me before?" He said, "I didn't know how to start." She said, "You start at the beginning." He said, "The beginning is the hard part." The beginning was April 29th, 1945, the morning he stopped walking. Everything before that was the story of how he got there. Everything after that was the story of what he did with what he found there. The beginning was the stopped walking, and the stopped walking was what he had not been able to give anyone, because the stopped walking was not a describable event. It was an experience of the body before the mind, and the body's experience is the hardest thing to transfer from one person to another through language. He began speaking publicly in the late 1950s, when the first generation of organized Holocaust education efforts began asking survivors and witnesses to come to schools and community events and speak about what they had seen. Harold Berman was not a survivor in the technical sense that the word was coming to carry. He was a witness. He had been present for 2 hours on one morning and had then moved on with his unit and the army and eventually home. He did not carry what the survivors carried. He was clear about this distinction and insisted on it when people elided it. What he carried was the 2 hours, the stopped walking, the minute of stillness, the specific quality of the silence that was not quiet, the removal of the floor. He carried these things to auditoriums and classrooms and memorial services for the next 40 years. And he tried in each venue to give the people in front of him something of what he was carrying, some fraction of the experience that the words could convey, enough to build a bridge across the gap between the word and the thing the word referred to. The audiences received what he gave. He could see the receiving in the quality of the attention, the stillness in the room that his words produced. He was a good speaker. He was not a performer. He had learned, through years of doing this, the specific craft of testimony, which is different from the craft of storytelling or persuasion. Testimony is not trying to produce an effect. It is trying to transfer an experience. The craft is in finding the words that carry the experience closest to intact across the gap between the speaker and the listener. He was good at the craft. He knew he was good at it. He also knew that even at his best, the transfer was incomplete. This is the thing he returned to in every private account of his public speaking. Not the content of what he said, the adequacy of what he said. He gave a talk and it was received, and people were moved, and people thanked him, and sometimes people came to him afterward with tears on their faces and told him that he had changed something in how they understood what had happened. He accepted these responses with the gratitude they deserved. He also drove home afterward and sat in the car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. And in those minutes, he measured the distance between what he had said and what he had been trying to say. And the distance was always there. Ruth asked him once, in the 1970s, after he came home from a particularly well-received talk at a high school in Indianapolis, why he always sat in the car before coming in. He said, "I'm counting what I left out." She asked, "What do you mean?" He said, "After every talk, there are things I didn't say, things I couldn't find the words for. I sit in the car and I go through them. I think about whether there were words I didn't try that might have worked." She said, "Do you ever find them?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Not yet. Not yet." He had been giving talks for 15 years at that point and had not yet found the words that closed the gap completely. And the "not yet" implied that he believed the words might exist, and that the finding of them was still possible if he kept trying. This was not optimism in the ordinary sense. It was the stubbornness of a man who understood that the testimony mattered even when it was incomplete, that the incomplete transfer was better than no transfer, that the fraction of the experience that the words could convey was worth conveying even though it was a fraction. He had a specific way of explaining this to himself. He said that a photograph of a mountain is not the mountain. Everyone who has seen a photograph of a mountain and then stood at the base of one knows the difference. The photograph is true. The mountain is true. The photograph of the mountain is not the mountain. But the photograph is not nothing. It gives the person who has not stood at the base of the mountain something real, a true piece of information about the mountain that is better than no information. And that prepares them in some small way for the standing, if they ever stand there. His testimony was the photograph. The morning of April 29th was the mountain. The photograph was true. The mountain was still larger than the photograph. The photograph was still worth making. He spoke at a high school in Terre Haute in 1992. He was 69 years old. His knees were giving him the same trouble his father's knees had given his father, which is one of the many forms of continuity that a life produces. He had been speaking publicly for more than 30 years. He had spoken to perhaps 40,000 people in those years, in schools and synagogues and churches and community centers and veterans' halls and university lecture rooms. The high school talk was not different from the others in most respects. He told the story of getting to Germany. He told the story of the approach to Dachau. He told the story of the stopped walking and the minute of stillness. He told the story of what he had spent 50 years trying to explain, and why the explanation remained incomplete, and why he kept trying to give it anyway. At the end of the talk, a student raised her hand. She was perhaps 16, sitting in the third row with a notebook in her lap, and she had the specific quality of attention that Harold had learned to recognize in the students who were genuinely receiving what he was saying, rather than waiting for it to be over. She asked, "If you can never fully explain what you saw, why do you keep trying?" Harold Berman looked at her for a moment. He said, "Because you need to know it happened. Not what it felt like to see it. That's mine, and I'll take it with me. You need to know it happened. Those are different things. What I felt is not transferable. What happened is. And what happened is the thing you cannot afford to not know." The girl wrote something in her notebook. Harold drove home and sat in the car in the driveway and went through what he had left out. There was always something left out. The morning of April 29th was still larger than any description of it. The stopped walking was still not fully transferable. The removal of the floor was still something that words approached but did not reach. But the girl in the third row had written something in her notebook. That was the fraction. That was the photograph. That was what the 40 years of trying had been for, not the complete transfer, which was not available, but the fraction, which was. He gave his last public talk in 1998. He was 75. His health had been declining for 2 years, and the travel that public speaking required had become difficult in ways that his body was no longer willing to negotiate. Ruth had died in 1996. The children were grown and scattered across Indiana and Illinois. The hardware store had been sold years before to a chain, which was the fate of most independent hardware stores in America in the last decades of the 20th century. The last talk was at an elementary school, which was not where he had expected to give his last talk. He had agreed to it because the teacher who invited him had been persistent, and because the school was only 12 miles from Terre Haute, and because Harold Berman had never refused a school that asked him, and was not going to start refusing them now. The children were 10 and 11 years old. They were too young for the full account, and Harold knew this and adjusted his talk accordingly, telling the story at the altitude appropriate for 10 and 11-year-olds, which meant more about the soldier from Indiana and less about the specific weight of what the soldier had found. He told them about the war and about being young and far from home, and about the morning when his unit arrived at a place in Germany where something very terrible had happened. He told them that people had been hurt very badly in that place. He told them that it was important to know this had happened. He told them that knowing it had happened was one of the things that helped make sure it did not happen again. One of the children, a boy in the front row who had been watching Harold with the concentrated attention that children sometimes bring to things they are trying to understand and are not quite reaching, raised his hand. He asked, "Did it make you sad?" Harold Berman looked at the boy for a moment. He said, "Yes, it made me sad. It still does." The boy nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected, and confirmed something he had been working out. The teacher thanked Harold after the talk. Harold drove back to Terre Haute. He did not sit in the car in the driveway that time, which was not a decision he made consciously. He simply got out of the car and went inside and made a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in the house where he and Ruth had raised 3 children, and where he had come home to after 40 years of talks, in 40 years of schools and community halls and memorial services. He died in 2001 at the age of 78. His daughter found the notebooks after he died. Not one notebook, 14 notebooks, spanning 40 years of public speaking, each entry dated and titled with the name and location of the talk. Each entry contains the same structure: a brief description of the audience, a brief description of how the talk went, and then, at the end of each entry, a list. The list is the things he left out, the things he tried to say and could not find the words for, the things that were true and that the words available to him did not contain. The list is different for every talk, not because different things were left out, but because the attempt to reach the untransferable thing came from a different angle each time, and from different angles, different parts of the gap became visible. The last entry in the last notebook is dated 1998, the year of the elementary school talk. The description of the audience is brief. The evaluation of the talk is brief. The list of things left out is the shortest in the notebooks. Below the list, he wrote one sentence that does not appear in any other entry. He wrote, "I think the boy understood." This was not a claim that the transfer had finally been complete. It was not the finding of the words he had been looking for in the driveway for 40 years. It was something else. The recognition that understanding was not the same as receiving the experience intact. That the boy in the front row who had asked, "Did it make you sad?" had understood something true and had done so without needing the experience itself, because the experience was not what needed to be transferred. What needed to be transferred was what Harold had told the girl in the 3rd row 6 years earlier. You need to know it happened, not what it felt like. That was his. He had taken it with him, as he said he would, as the notebooks document across 40 years of trying to give away what could not be given away, and giving away what could be, which was the fact, the specific, dated, historical fact of what human beings had done to other human beings in a place in Bavaria. Documented and testified to and spoken about in classrooms across Indiana for 4 decades by a man from Terre Haute who had stopped walking one morning in April of 1945 and had never quite started walking again in exactly the same way. The notebooks are in the possession of his daughter. The testimony he gave in 1945 is in the National Archives. The talks he gave across 4 decades exist in the memories of the people who heard them, which is an impermanent archive, but a real one. The girl in the 3rd row who wrote something in her notebook in 1992 is in her late 40s now. She does not know that Harold Berman remembered her specifically, that the notebook entry for that day describes her attention and her question and the way she wrote something down. She does not know that the man who answered her question drove home and sat in the car and measured the gap between what he had said and what he had meant, and found it smaller than usual that day. She knows what happened. That was the whole point. That was the only point. That was the thing Harold Berman drove 12 miles and 50 miles and 100 miles for 40 years to give to the people who sat in the chairs in front of him. The simple, irreducible fact that could be transferred even when the experience behind it could not. The fact that was worth transferring even in the absence of the experience. The fact that was the photograph, even though the mountain was always larger. It happened. You need to know it happened. That is what he spent 50 years saying. And it was true when he said it the first time. And it was true when the boy in the front row nodded. And it is true now, which is the specific property of facts as opposed to experiences. That facts do not diminish with time and do not require the presence of the person who witnessed them in order to remain true. Harold Berman witnessed it. He told you it happened. The telling is his gift and his testimony and the work of his life after the war, offered to everyone who was not there and needs to know anyway. It happened. If this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe. The men and women who witnessed the liberation of the camps in 1945 spent the rest of their lives as the last direct link between what happened and the people who needed to know it happened. We owe them our attention. Thank you for watching. The 45th Infantry Division liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945. The division had been activated in 1926 and had fought through North Africa and Sicily and Italy before coming to France and Germany. It was a National Guard division, which meant its men were not career soldiers, but civilians in uniform. Men from Oklahoma and Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona, who had been grocers and farmers and teachers and hardware store owners before the war, made them soldiers. The liberation of Dachau was not a planned military objective in the operational sense that most objectives of the final campaign were planned. The division had been moving through Bavaria as part of the broader Allied advance, and the camp was simply there, in the path of the advance. And when they arrived, they found what they found. The commanding general, Brigadier General Henning Linden, arrived at the camp on the same day as the infantry, and his after-action report contains the same quality of inadequacy that all accounts of that morning contain. The sense of a man trying to use the language of military reporting to describe something that military reporting language was not designed to contain. The report describes what was found, the numbers, the conditions, the evidence of the camp's operation across 12 years. The report is accurate. It is also, like Harold Berman's testimony and every other account of that morning, a photograph of a mountain. The camp had been established in 1933 as the first of the concentration camp system, the template from which the subsequent camps in the network were modeled. In 12 years of operation, it had held more than 200,000 prisoners from across occupied Europe, political prisoners and Jewish prisoners, and prisoners of war, and people whose only crime was membership in a category that the regime had designated as unacceptable. More than 41,000 documented deaths had occurred there. The documentation is incomplete. The actual number was higher. The men of the 45th Infantry Division who walked into the camp on April 29th were the first Americans most of the surviving prisoners had seen. And the response of the survivors to the arrival of the soldiers is described in account after account from both sides in terms that the word relief does not fully contain. Because relief implies the removal of a fear. And what the surviving prisoners were experiencing was something larger than the removal of a fear. It was the arrival of the evidence that the world outside the camp had not entirely forgotten that they existed, which was not something they had been able to count on. Harold Berman described this specifically in his 1992 talk, the one where the girl in the third row wrote something in her notebook. He described the faces of the survivors, not the conditions, the faces. He said the faces were what he had been carrying for 47 years, more than anything else he had seen that morning, because the faces contained in them a specific quality of human experience that he had not known existed before that morning, and that he had not been able to forget since. He said the faces told him something about what people could survive and still be people, which was a thing he had not understood the full dimension of before that morning. He said he had arrived at Dachau believing, without having examined the belief, that there was a level of what could be done to a person beyond which the person was no longer fully themselves, that the self had some threshold of damage past which it ceased to be the self. He said the faces of the survivors told him that this belief was wrong, that the self was more durable than he had believed, that the people who had been in that camp were entirely themselves, present and human and individual, in a way that he found he was not prepared for, and that moved him in a way that the other things he had seen that morning did not. This is the part of the testimony that Harold considered the most important and the most difficult to convey. Not the evidence of what had been done, the evidence of what had survived the doing. The specific indestructibility of the human person that the survivors demonstrated by being present and being themselves on the morning of April 29, 1945. He said in one of the later talks, in the early 1990s, when he was refining the account he had been giving for 30 years, "I went into that camp and I saw the worst that people do to each other. I also saw that the people who had been through the worst were still people, still entirely themselves. I had not expected that. I have thought about it ever since. I think it might be the most important thing I know." The most important thing he knew. He had been saying it for 30 years by the time he said it in those words. He had been circling it and approaching it and retreating from it in every talk he had ever given, trying to find the angle from which it was fully transmissible. He had found that it was not fully transmissible. He had found that the partial transmission was worth doing. What the transmission accomplished across 40,000 people in 40 years of talks was not the complete transfer of what Harold had experienced on April 29th. That was not available. What it accomplished was the building of a bridge, plank by plank, talk by talk, between the fact of what had happened and the people who needed to carry the fact forward when the witnesses were no longer there to carry it themselves. The witnesses are no longer there. The men of the 45th Infantry Division who walked into Dachau on April 29, 1945, are gone. The survivors of the camp are almost entirely gone. The living memory of that morning exists now only in the people who heard the testimony while the testimony was being given, and in the records and the archives and the notebooks and the histories that the testimony produced. Harold Berman's 14 notebooks are part of that record. The testimony he gave in 1945 is part of that record. The talks he gave across 4 decades are part of that record, in the impermanent archive of the people who heard them and carried what they heard into their own lives and their own understanding. The girl in the 3rd row wrote something in her notebook in 1992. Whatever she wrote is part of that record too, in the permanent archive of a person who was told something true and received it and did something with the receiving, even if the something is only the carrying, the knowledge held in a person's understanding the way knowledge is held, present and active and available when the world requires it. You need to know it happened. Harold Berman said this to 40,000 people over 40 years. He is saying it now, through the notebooks and the testimony and the accounts of the people who heard him, and through this telling of the story of a man from Terre Haute, Indiana, who stopped walking one morning in April 1945 and spent the rest of his life trying to give away the weight of what the stopping had cost him. Not the weight itself, which was his, but the knowledge the weight contained, which belonged to everyone. It happened. You know it now. That was enough for Harold Berman. It has to be enough for us.